I want to introduce our speaker tonight, Scott Vierick, and he is a senior historian. I'm a senior and a historian, but not a senior historian. So I don't know, you might want to double think that term. You know, master historian or something sounds, you know, like very, very appropriate for what you're doing. And so, but he's a senior historian and interpretive planner. And it's very exciting to me to see that as a job title. I don't think it existed, let's say 20 years ago. It sure didn't exist for me in college. Public history didn't exist in college. The term public archaeology was first used, in my knowledge, by Bob McGimsey in a book called Public Archaeology, written the same year, or published the same year I took the job here in 1977. And Alexandria was already doing public history and public archaeology. It just didn't have a name yet. And Bob McGimsey was the state archaeologist in Arkansas, and he put forward a very strong statement in a book about how archaeologists need to be doing the actions of archaeology in the public good and for public information. And over the years, what has also become involved in public is the fact that the public, meaning everyone, gets to have a discussion and dialogue about what is history. Now, this isn't always comfy. It's not always convenient. And guess what? People have very different perspectives on the past. For instance, if you have a sibling, you might have remembered something differently about when you grew up. I see a few heads. I've been talking to classmates of mine from grade school, and I can remember things that they absolutely have no idea. And when I hear what they were doing, I feel I really missed out because I was not having all the fun time those girls were having. I totally missed out. I never met the Italian stallion. And it's a loss, or maybe I forgot, but I don't think so. Anyhow, there are many, many perspectives. And so it's exciting for me that Scott works for a company, History Associates Incorporated. By the way, our first corporate sponsor, so thank you, History Associates, Inc., and everybody here that works there, and the job that you're doing and supporting us. And if you have a business or know of a business or an organization that would like to support us at the corporate level or sponsor one of our social hours with a few little tidbits of food and drink, we'd be happy to accept your sponsorship. So Scott is actually, I guess you're almost born into history. You were born in Philadelphia. Can't get much more American history than that. He did not tell me yet anything about his family, but I do know from talking to students of mine who have, at George Washington University, who have continued to study history and archaeology even at the cost of thousands and thousands of dollars. When I say, why are you doing this? They say, because my parents took me around to historic sites, and I loved it, and it made a difference to me. And so that's why many of us still love history and have taken our children and our friends to historic places. Well, apparently, Scott was hooked with history very early on, and he even interned in Harper's Ferry, which strikes me as almost your first foray into Virginia, and then you've almost never left. Scott went on to major in history and government at William & Mary and get a master's degree in public administration from Virginia Tech. And then he's certified in museum management, interpretive planning. There's nothing you can't do. Oh, maybe archaeology.
Well.
Not, oh, well, no.
Commission, okay,
no,
all right.
no,
I'm not
no.
I'm not moving on to your turf.
Okay. You got to be certified for that.
Okay,
Or
okay.
have a lot of patience.
Sure.
Patience.
I have neither of those things.
I
so.
didn't think so, because you're a historian. Anyhow, I'm happy to say that Scott stayed here in Virginia and has been working here for a number of years for History Associates, Inc. And his work goal is to connect people to their past. That I asked, what is your goal? How clear, how simple? And what is his passion? His passion is doing this in Alexandria. And so to this end, not only is he giving his speech tonight, but he volunteered to join the board of Alexandria Historical Society. We don't get all that many volunteers. And he also volunteered to take on our social media campaign and to be a commission member of the Archaeological Commission. And so you have jumped in head, feet, hands into public history in Alexandria. And I know your knowledge, but also your heart and love of history will add to what has been done and what so many people have built upon. When I first came to Alexandria, the Historical Society was just starting. I didn't know that, it seemed ancient to me. And the people who ran it were pretty ancient, I thought themselves. In fact, I probably can say I'm a lot older than those ancient people were. And it seems important to keep this going as we are now celebrating, and our next season will be our 50th anniversary of the Historical Society. So thank you for coming tonight, and I'm really interested in hearing Scott's discussion of what a consulting historian really does. Thank you.
What year did the group start?
1974.
All right, well, thank you, Pam, for that introduction, and thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. I'm Scott Vierick, and welcome to my talk. Nobody told me there'd be crocodiles, consulting historians, and history as a team sport. So over the course of the discussion tonight, I'll be talking a little bit about the work that consulting historians do, some of the projects I've seen, and just some of the insights that I've observed over my time in the field. And it's a time that's allowed me to travel to sites around the country, encounter incredible stories from the past, and yes, meet up with a very friendly crocodile. So before we go any further, we do have to do a couple of disclaimers. Before I get started, I do need to say that I am not speaking for History Associates, its employees, clients, or owners. I also have a part-time gig on weekends giving tours at Mount Vernon, so I'm also required to say that I am not speaking for the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, its employees or owners. And as a board member of the Alexandria Historical Society, I need to say I'm not speaking for them. I'm also not speaking for the Alexandria Archaeological Commission, the College of William and Mary, Virginia Tech, and, you know, while we're at it, the Kingdom of Sweden. These are my views and opinions only. They don't represent the views of my company, my colleagues, my friends, my casual acquaintances. They're mine and mine alone. So before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty, I do want to give you guys a couple of highlights of some of the projects that consulting historians work on. And I want to start off by talking about a historical research project where we were contracted to write a short narrative history report, about 10 to 20 pages, about a shoe store in York, Pennsylvania. So the client had hired us to write this history, and this was during the COVID-19 pandemic, so we're doing a lot of this research online, utilizing online databases. I'm looking through old newspapers, because of course newspapers for a business, you can find their ads, you can find information about openings and closings, you can find retrospective articles. So I'm looking at these articles and I'm noticing something a little weird. You've got the name of the shoe store, which was Reinberg Shoes, but they're listing two locations on the same street. So I'm thinking, that's kind of odd. Then I remember that on King Street, there's two Comfort One shoe locations directly across the street from each other. And I go, okay, maybe that's not so odd after all. But as I'm looking at these ads, I'm noticing that their mottos are different. The types of shoes they're selling are different. They're doing different taglines. The fonts of the ads are different. So I'm wondering what's going on. And as I dig deeper, what I found was a case of family fighting, forbidden love, and some very, very, very comfortable shoes. So we'll return to this story later on in the talk. The second case I want to highlight took me to the wonderful state of Florida. We had been hired to help redevelop a visitor center in Everglades National Park. And Everglades is a very large national park. There's a number of visitor centers. We were doing the one marked by the red arrow all the way at the bottom of the map, where the Everglades meets Florida Bay. So not only are we researching the history of the Everglades and working to communicate that with the general public, we're also writing about the animals, the plant life found there. We're including safety information about why you shouldn't try to, say, hug a manatee. So as part of this, I got to go to several business trips down in the Everglades. Even though we're down in, quite frankly, one of the most beautiful places on earth, a business trip is a business trip, so we're spending a lot of time in conference rooms discussing the project. But we did get out into the park at a certain number of points, and at one point we go out into the park, we're looking at the visitor center, we go over to take some reference photos of a nearby canal, and who should start swimming towards us but this guy. So that was about a 7-foot-long American crocodile, and crocodiles were actually one of the main animals that we wanted to talk about in the visitor center, so it worked out very well. I was able to snap that picture of it, and later on in the project, turns out we needed another picture of a crocodile. We had already spent most of our budget for licensing images. Boom. Little did that crocodile know that that day when it swam out, it was going to be immortalized in Everglades Visitor Center history. So we're going from shoe stores in Pennsylvania to Everglades in Florida. So different locations, different projects. Really, it does highlight the fact that history, it's found just about everywhere. But as Pam alluded to, history, it's also complicated. It can be distressing. It can be difficult. And the third type of project really hammers that home. So one of the services that History Associates offers is slavery disclosure research. So if a company needs to disclose any ties to antebellum slavery, we're hired to do the corporate genealogy research, figure out what companies were associated with this company, if there are any mergers or acquisitions, whether these predecessor companies were active prior to the American Civil War. And then we'll go to where the company was active, we'll go through local repositories, and we'll write down the names of the people traded by these companies. And oftentimes this involves reviewing hundreds of pages of documents, noting thousands of names of men, women, and children who were trafficked under this system. So again, we'll be swinging back around to this type of project later on in the talk, but again, 3 very different projects, all under this banner of consulting history. So Pam mentioned earlier this idea of public history, and it really unites so much of what we all do, and, but I like to give definitions before I start talking about something. So quite simply, public history, it's history beyond the walls of a classroom. So it's any type of history that goes beyond just doing simple academic research, teaching in a college, high school, elementary school context. National Council on Public History is kind of a more expansive definition that describes it as the many and diverse ways in which history is put to work in the world. In this sense, it is history that is applied to real-world issues. And here in Alexandria, public history is all around us, whether it's a historic house museum like the Lee Fendel House, whether it's a museum like the Lyceum where we're all here tonight, whether it's the work by Alexandria Archaeology, the activities of the Office of Historic Alexandria, or even the work done by the Alexandria Historical Society. The one key thing, though, to keep in mind is even though we're doing history that's really geared towards the public, that doesn't mean we're applying any less rigor than an academic historian would be. And in fact, National Council on Public History explicitly notes that in terms of intellectual approach, the theory and methodology of public history remain firmly in the discipline of history. And all good public history rests on sound scholarship. So we're still checking our sources. We're still doing as much research as we can. We're gathering as much information as we can. But with public history, you never know who your audience can be. And I put this photo on the slide very explicitly. This is a photo of the new exhibits at Jimmy Carter National Historical Park in Plains, Georgia. We had the great privilege to work on the new exhibits there at Plains High School. That's where Jimmy Carter got his education. That's where he met Rosalind Carter. And the gentleman visiting those exhibits, the gentleman to the right, left talking to the park ranger, that is former President Jimmy Carter. So with public history, you never know who's going to be interacting with the work that you do. It can even be the person that you're writing about. So how do consulting historians fit into this field? Well, consulting historians, they're the ones deploying the historic method and best practices in research and writing towards this audience outside of academia. So consulting historians can either work as freelancers, working for themselves, or they can be working as part of a firm like History Associates. And they can work with anyone. They can work with companies, nonprofits, museums, historic sites. Now, I do want to make one thing very clear is that it's not a hard and fast boundary between academic and public history and academic historians and consulting historians. You have academic historians who do consulting in addition to their academic duties, either for pay or volunteer. You have consulting historians who teach classes or even eventually go back into academia and become tenured faculty. Likewise, consulting historians, sometimes they'll get jobs at institutions like the National Park Service, Library of Congress, and sometimes you get historians at those organizations becoming consulting historians. So there's a lot of cooperation between public and academic historians, a lot of cooperation between consulting and academic historians. Ultimately, cooperation is a huge part of any public history endeavor. So why do consulting historians do what they do? Well, ultimately, everyone has a story to preserve and share. So history, it's the study of the past. Everyone has a past. Everyone has a history to be studied. And it's the interaction of all these pasts, all these stories that makes up the study of history. So that's why legal firms, commercial businesses, government agencies, associations and institutions, they all have a need for good, well-done, well-researched history. So a bit of background on me. Pam covered this very well, so we'll just kind of skim through it. But I started work at History Associates about 6.5 years ago. It's going to be 7 years in December. Before that, I worked at the White House Historical Association as an educator and at the National Park Service at Harpers Ferry as a seasonal ranger. And I also worked for a time as a part-time history interpreter, also known as a tour guide at Mount Vernon, and I still work there on weekends. You know, got to do something to keep me out of trouble. And got my degree in history and government from William & Mary, MPA from Virginia Tech. So you can see some pictures of there and me. That's me in the Civil War uniform. That was when I was at Harpers Ferry. Me in the colonial gear. That's me at Mount Vernon during a candlelight tour. And then the photo of me with the saber-toothed tiger, that was me exploring a museum, which just thought it was a funny image. Those of you who were here for Steve Hammond's talk last month, he had that very funny image of himself underneath the title of his talk, so I figured I had to try and match him. So, brief history of the organization I work for, History Associates Incorporated. We've been in business for over 40 years at this point, and our genesis is actually in the 3 Mile Island disaster. So, government historian was tasked with writing a history of what happened shortly after the disaster and the events to contain it unfolded. And so he reached out to several of his colleagues and asked if they could help him out. And one of History Associates' co-founders responded, "What do you mean write a history? It happened just 3 weeks ago. What do you mean a history?" But sure enough, they were able to apply the methodology of historical research to this very recent event, write up a full history for it that was then submitted to the government, was very well received, a valuable tool for both future historians and future policymakers and employees of the federal government. And so these historians figured, you know what? This was fun. We enjoyed this. We can make money off of this. And wouldn't you know it, shortly after that, in 1981, they founded History Associates Incorporated. Now, the business has grown and changed quite a bit since then. We've added new service lines. Currently, we've got over 40 historians, archivists, and support staff. We are based in Rockville, Maryland. We've got 3 major service lines today, including archives, litigation, and the third one that includes exhibits and interpretive planning. I mostly work on the history side. So our archivists, they do incredible work. They have done over 64,000 linear feet of archives that they've surveyed. But my talk today is going to be mostly about the history side. But if you have any questions about the work that our archivists do, please feel free to ask me at the end of the talk. Likewise, if there's a lot of questions, well, maybe one of these future talks we can get one of my archivist colleagues to come and give the lecture. But the work we do on the historian side really kind of focuses on historical research and historical interpretation. So gathering sources, gathering facts, and then finding the best ways to communicate that to our audiences. So I'm going to talk about one of the key parts of our historical research efforts, and that's our litigation service line. So with our litigation service line, we get hired by law firms to conduct historical research in relation to ongoing court cases and legal disputes. And the genesis of that was one of our founders was doing research at the National Archives, And out of curiosity, how many of you have done research at the National Archives? All right, I am seeing a good amount of hands. So you all know that you don't just go in there and ask, I need all your World War II records. No, you gotta come prepared. The National Archives, there's so many documents. They're organized into many different record groups. The record groups are all organized differently. So if you don't have a historical background, historical research background, it can be a very frustrating process. It can be a very infuriating process. So one of our founders was doing research there, and he overheard somebody becoming very, very frustrated. Turns out it was a land commissioner from Texas trying to get some documents, not able to get very far. co-founder says, hey, we can help you out with that. And the commissioner goes, all right, you write up a contract, you meet me tomorrow. They met him tomorrow, the guy signed the contract, and off we went. So a lot of the research, it includes environmental litigation, historical land use, Native American land use rights cases, and slavery disclosure research. So this involves a lot of going to places like the National Archives, finding files relating to contracts, land use records, treaties, government reports, legislative documents, synthesizing them, and doing it all fairly quickly. So a lot of the times our clients are working on a deadline. So a key skill is not only being able to research, but being able to do that efficiently and quickly. So to give you all an example, earlier this year I was on a litigation project where the client had a deadline coming up. They knew where the documents were. We reached out to the repository. They said, yep, come, we can help you out with that. We said, great. And we have a variety of tools we use to collect documents really quickly. We've got scanners that we bring with us that you put the document down, you hit a button, boom, it's uploaded to your computer. So we were getting ready to bring all our technology to bear on that, and the repository says, yeah, we don't actually allow electronics in our facility. So we said, oh, okay, so no scanners, no scanners. No smartphones, no cameras, laptops are okay. Okay, great. Can we take pictures with our laptop cameras? No. So we go up there, they had an old scanner that only took $1 and $5 bills, so we were just feeding through, there was a ton of documents. At several points they ran out of paper and they had to run out and get more paper. That's how much we were collecting. But we got it done. We got the documents, we got them to the client was very happy with them. And the folks at the repository were very helpful despite all the restrictions, and so we ended up giving them a gift after the project concluded, as a way of thanks, because ultimately, without their assistance, we would not have been able to have gotten this work done. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are thinking right now, so wait, you're hired by these law firms, so what's stopping you guys from just giving the law firms what they want to hear? That goes back to what I was saying earlier about maintaining historical integrity when you're doing public history. So our historical integrity, it's key to what we do as consulting historians. And honestly, our law firm clients, they get that. Because put yourself in the space of a lawyer. The last thing you want to do is get a lot of real complimentary information as you're preparing the case, and then during the deposition or during the trial, the other side gives some really contradictory, some really troubling documentation that just destroys your whole case. So by and large, our law firm clients, they want to know everything now. Good, bad, ugly, and that's what we do. For the litigation work I've done, I've given documents, I've found documents for cases where it's like, oh yeah, no, it seems like the client's got a pretty good case there. I've done other cases where I'm looking through it and I'm like, ooh, nope, this doesn't support you at all. But again, end of the day, it all goes to the law firm. They want to hear it. We don't hide anything from them. We don't whitewash anything. Because again, that's not what the client wants, and that's certainly not what we want to be doing as historians. Now, when it comes to our litigation work, a lot of the stuff, we do have confidentiality rules in place. So I can't talk about a lot of specific cases, but there are two cases I do want to highlight. One actually deals with a local site. How many of you have ever gone hiking along the Washington and Old Dominion Trail? So yeah, we've got a couple of people here. So many years ago, Dominion Power was planning on doing some construction work nearby to the trail that the trail owners at Nova Park were concerned was going to impact some of the historical resources. So they came to History Associates to do research on the trail and figure out what was historically significant, whether that was worth protecting. And so our historians got on it. They did, among other things, they searched secondary sources, so previously collected reports. So much of history, it's finding new information, but it's also seeing what others have done and building upon that. It's looking at primary sources in special collections in places like the special collections at Arlington Public Library, the special collections of the Fairfax County Public Library. It involved looking at National Register of Historic Places registration forms. And it also involved a site visit where the historians actually went along the entire length of the Washington and Old Dominion Trail. No, they didn't hike it. They took a car down it. So again, if you were on the Washington and Old Dominion Trail and you had to get out of the way because the car was going by, That might have been some of my coworkers. Ultimately, this culminated in one of the historians serving as an expert witness. The testimony they gave, it's available on Google if you ever want to read it. And in the end, Nova Parks won. Dominion had to readjust their construction plans in order to preserve these resources. So the other type I really want to focus on, I want to go back to the slavery disclosure research I mentioned before. So various jurisdictions have rules saying that if you want to do business in our city, if you're a financial firm, you need to discuss any ties to antebellum slavery. So we get hired to do corporate genealogy research because, again, you might have a company that was formally founded in, say, 1902, but maybe they acquired a business that was founded in 1803 and operated in, say, Louisiana. So that's step one, is figuring out, okay, what are the predecessor organizations? What's this corporate family tree, if you will? And then from there, we're looking at conveyance records in local repositories. And these are records of transfers of property, which, again, for much of this country's history, included people. So we look at these conveyance records, and we document the transactions that took place and the name of the people who were being trafficked. And so the project I was on, it was a whole week of traveling to various repositories and just writing down all the names of the people. And some of the places we were going to, the conveyance records had two columns. One was for all other types of property, and then there was one column that was just for enslaved people. So again, it just highlights how often men, women, and children were trafficked. You hear folks say that slavery, it was benign, it was in the past, it was fine, we don't need to talk about it. And looking at these conveyance records just highlights the fact that no, it was cruel, it was unjust. It was a huge part of history. We absolutely do need to talk about it. So the work we do involves identifying these connections to antebellum slavery, getting the names of the people who were trafficked as part of this. Right now, there's a big movement to document the names of those who were trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean as part of the transatlantic slave trade and build databases so that you can start to connect the names on various pieces of documents. I think these conveyance records at local repositories, I think that's going to be the next step of building these connections between sources. Most of the slavery disclosure research we can't talk about because, again, we've got confidentiality reports. But one time a reporter from the Wall Street Journal found out that we were doing work for J.P. Morgan, and they wrote a whole article about it, and we were interviewed as part of that, so that's why I can list that up there. And ultimately, J.P. Morgan, after they were presented with the findings that our historians did, they created a scholarship for African American students in Louisiana. So again, it does you no good to hire troubling, uncomfortable history. The best thing to do is really to bring it to light. So that's the historical research we do for litigation, but we also do more general historical research for companies and organizations. Now in these projects, we are really serving as the historian. Other members of the project team, the clients, they're looking for us to kind of be the last word on, well, what happened in this company's history? What are the sources? What's the story? And this can often involve going through internal company archives, conducting research using online databases, using online newspaper databases. Oral histories are another key tool that we use to capture the experiences of longtime employees. Oral histories, they captured the stories, the recollections, the insights that aren't necessarily going to be found in other documents. And the City of Alexandria, if you ever want to explore some oral histories yourself, City of Alexandria has some really great ones relating to Fort Ward, as well as to the workers at the old Potomac Yard Rail Yard. Now the final products for the work we do for this more general historical research, it can include books, it can include reports, it can include websites, online exhibits, or online timelines. Really depends on the needs of the client. So I'm going to return to the first story that I was talking about with the mysterious case of two shoe stores. So as I determined, there were definitely two shoe stores. I kept digging. I found some other documentation. I conducted an oral history with the last owner of the shoe store. And what actually happened was, so the original shoe store, Reineberg's, which was not the one that we were researching, the original shoe store, the proprietor in the 1870s was getting ready to turn it over to his son, pass on the family business to him. Well, the son was in love with someone outside of the family's religion. So the owner of the shoe store, for him, that was a big no deal. When that son went off and married this person, he cut him out of the family entirely, more or less shunned him. So what did the son do? Well, he took all that knowledge he had about shoemaking. He opened his own Rheinberg shoe store on the same street. And so I'm finding these documents, I'm chatting with the last owner, and again, this was a shoe store that lasted from the 1870s all the way to 2019. So there were plenty of things in its history to talk about. I could do a whole talk just focusing on the story of the shoe store. And the thing that he wondered about was, well, the two families, they never reconciled. He didn't know what happened to the other Rheinberg shoe store. So I did some more digging, and I was able to find out that that shoe store closed early in the Great Depression, then the family moved away. So the father kicks out the son. His shoe store, the father's shoe store only makes it another couple of decades. The son's shoe store goes all the way to 2019. So again, when I first took this project, I had no idea the type of stories I was going to be uncovering. I'm like, all right, yeah, history of a shoe store. I can take that and run with it. But again, it ended up finding a whole family feud there that just was just really enlightening. So another type of research we did was for a historic African-American community in Emery Grove in Montgomery County, Maryland. So this was a community founded by formerly enslaved individuals after the American Civil War, lasted all the way until the 1960s when urban development displaced many of the community members. The church, though, stayed in the area, and the church was working with the developer to build some new affordable housing. And as part of that, they wanted to really research the community's history, document the community's history. So we were hired to write a report about this community's history, and we wrote the report based on previous studies, census documents, land reports, and newspaper articles. And then we also did an oral history with 2 long-term residents. And I was very privileged to get to be the one to do the oral history. And I'm interviewing them, and I said, oh, so your great-grandmother, she was one of the original inhabitants of this community. Can you tell me a little bit about her? And the woman, without missing a beat, goes, oh, yes. She was enslaved. She was about 12 when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And she said that before that, during the Civil War, at one point, her slaveholder was trying to sell her, but she begged and pleaded, and she fought, and eventually he gave up. And then a couple of years later, slavery ended in Maryland. So, just think about, and the woman's great-grandmother lived all the way to the 1950s. So again, just the story, the bravery to fight back against your slaveholder, to then build a new life after the Civil War and build this family in this community, facing the segregation, the racism, and just all the things that she saw in her whole life that, again, stretched from the 1850s all the way to the 1950s. So again, we created a report for that. We're doing work with them that's ongoing, but again, it's been a spectacular project to work on and just to hear these stories. So kind of turning away from the research towards communicating that research, interpreting that research, that's really what we do with the exhibits and interpretive media. Now in those projects, we're serving as a historian. So we are typically part of a team. Oftentimes we're working with experts in the field, people who have devoted their whole lives to the subjects we're interpreting. Our job is to serve as content matter experts, meaning that we're synthesizing the research, we're figuring out if there are any gaps that we can solve with additional research, and then we're taking all that research, all that information, books and theses worth of information, and then we're cramming it into exhibit panels. So best practice with museum exhibits is short and sweet. A panel like the ones my colleagues are standing in front of, you want to get around 150 to 200 words on those panels. You don't really want to go above that. So it's a matter of condensing all that information, writing it in a way that engages the visitors and promotes meaning and relevance so that the visitor keeps reading and wants to keep exploring. So, and the project I want to talk about next is another local one, and it was actually my first exhibit project, and it connects to last month's speaker, Steve Hammond's research, and that was the redevelopment of the exhibits at Arlington House. So David M. Rubenstein, the philanthropist, gave the National Park Service a lot of money to both fix a lot of the structural issues with Arlington House and also redevelop all the exhibits. History Associates got hired to be the content specialist on that. So it was my first exhibit project. I was a junior specialist. So again, I was very bottom of the pecking order, but it was a wonderful learning experience. And I was very fortunate. I got to read a lot of Steve Hammond's work as part of that project, really gather his insights. Again, goes back to what I was saying earlier. You're a historian on these projects. I could study my whole life. Would I know as much as Steve Hammond does about his family? No. But what I can do is I can figure out, okay, these are the stories. This is how we get that all onto an exhibit panel. These are good images, diagrams that we can use to help tell that story. And this is where we can find any information that's currently missing. So as part of that, I was doing research in the Arlington archives there. And the home, of course, was built by enslaved labor on the orders of George Washington Parke Custis, Martha Washington's grandson. And then, so he lived at the home for most of his life. We're doing research on him. I'm doing research looking at letters, and I came across one letter that a guest had written where they said, yes, I stayed at the home of George Washington Parke Custis. He is the author of many plays, all terrible. Which, as part of the project, I also had to read some of George Washington Parke Custis's plays, and yeah. So I'm finding that, and again, it's a quote that's just always stuck with me. Ultimately did not make it into the exhibit. A huge part of what we were doing with that exhibit was expanding the story beyond just Robert E. Lee, talking about the enslaved community there, the freedmen community there, talking about people like Maria Syphax, who was George Washington Parke Custis's unacknowledged daughter. He had her with an enslaved woman named Ariana Carter, and she later on got some land near Arlington, and her family successfully petitioned to hang on to it after the Civil War, telling the stories of folks like James Parks, who was enslaved at Arlington and then during the Civil War got a job working for the federal government, and then one day while he was working to build fortifications around the city, was given new orders to help dig some new graves near the house. So he actually dug some of the first graves at what would become Arlington National Cemetery. And he continued working at that cemetery all the way until 1925. So he did give an interview towards the end of his life, and when they asked him to reflect on all that he had seen, all that he had noticed over the years, he gave the quote, "See the big tombstones. When they buried them, important folks turned out, horses and men marching, big speeches. And the little tombstones, common soldiers. I carved out the last resting places for them all. When they get in the ground, they are all alike, generals and private soldiers, all alike sleeping in the same bed of ground." So that quote, that did make it into the exhibit. So again, what just a powerful quote that really connects the story of this man who, born enslaved on this plantation, and then helped build Arlington Cemetery into what it is today. So I do also want to return to another exhibit project I worked on with the Everglades. And I want to talk about that because, again, we're talking about a national park that not only has a very important historical component, but also a very strong natural history component. So we're melding a history talking about the indigenous inhabitants like the Tolosa and the Tequista, the Seminole tribes' activities in the area, but we're also melding that with information about the crocodiles, the manatees, and combining all that into an experience that hopefully really connects with visitors. A key part of what we were doing, though, was indigenous consultation. So the park had communications connections with the Seminole tribe of Florida, who had a hundreds of year presence in the Everglades. For many, that was the place they found refuge while the US government was trying to deport them to Oklahoma. So the Seminole tribe of Florida traces its ancestry to the Seminole people who were able to avoid deportation and were able to hide out in the Everglades and then rebuild the tribe. So they reviewed all the exhibit text we came up with, all the images, and one of the really important insights we got from them was, if you look at most histories, they say that the conflicts between the Seminole tribe and the US government, it was 3 separate conflicts. And we got the comment from the Seminole representatives that, well, for us, it was just one long struggle to try and hold on to our land. And so if you go to the visitor center, which they're still wrapping it up, it hasn't reopened yet, but if you go to that visitor center, it says Seminole War. Because again, for them, it was one long struggle. And so in addition to seeing the crocodile, we also saw a couple of manatees while we were there. They were a lot of fun. More pictures of the crocodile, because I think crocodiles are cool. Now, not all of our interpretation efforts involve physical museum exhibits. And I want to talk about one project we did for the American Battlefield Trust. So, oops, too far. Oh, I spoiled it. So the American Battlefield Trust Many of you know them from the preservation work. I mean, a huge chunk of the preserved land relating to this country's battlefields has been saved by the American Battlefield Trust. But they also do a lot of education and interpretation efforts, and they've done a line of smartphone apps that have been very successful, have been downloaded hundreds of thousands of times. And we've worked with them on a number of these smartphone apps. The one I got to work on was for a number of the battlefields in and around Richmond, and there was also a tour on that smartphone app of Civil War Richmond itself. So this was a really great opportunity to talk about some of these battles that are often overlooked. I mean, everybody's heard of Gettysburg. Who's heard of the Battle of Beaver Dam Creek? Exactly. So it was a chance to talk about some of these battles, talk about some of the political and social forces at play here. We did talk about Reconstruction. We did talk about Monument Avenue, going into the history of why those statues were raised, how they connected to Jim Crow America and segregation. And part of that was also visiting these sites. So the apps are meant to be enjoyed on the battlefield. And you want to make sure that when you're placing a location where people are going to go and people are going to follow that, it's not like on a highway or something. So we're doing the site visit. We're there in January. It's a beautiful first day. All the pictures you're seeing on this slide were from that first day when we're out there. While we're having lunch, the weather forecast changes and they start calling for snow. So we're like, well, do we go home? Do we keep moving forward with this? And I make the argument that, look, we don't know how much snow there's going to be. We don't know if there's even going to be snow. There's still a lot of uncertainty in the forecast. Let's just press on. So I wake up the next morning, and yeah, so they made me walk home. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, the next day was significantly colder, significantly snowier. We got through it. But it was one of those ironies where the picture in the lower right-hand corner, that is from the Second Deep Bottom battlefield. And that battle was fought in the summer. And in fact, you had soldiers passing out from heat stroke. Nobody was passing out from heat stroke when we visited there. Now, the last thing I want to talk about tonight, and I want to thank you all for your patience as I've rambled on about my career, but I want to talk about the work we do in interpretive planning. So you can do all this research, you can collect all these stories, but you got to make it meaningful to the public. You got to make those connections with the public so that the research you do doesn't just sit around somewhere gathering dust. So interpretive planning, it's the process of connecting sites, resources, and stories to visitors. It's making the visitors care, making them feel like they've got a stake in a location, they've got a stake in a site's story. And it's very much a team process. So my title is interpretive planner, but I really do see it as being a facilitator. So I'm working with staff members at a site. I'm working with major stakeholders like friends groups, indigenous tribes, descendants of people who were enslaved at these places. And really the goal of an interpretive plan is to create a roadmap for museums and historic sites to share their history. So it's identifying what are our resources, what are our stories, what are the stories we want to tell, what's the best way to make that happen? And that can involve a new exhibit, that can involve new tours, it can involve new stories on social media. It really depends on the site. So I want to share an example of one of those projects, and again, it's another Virginia one. Alexandria, we're here in the northern part of the state. Virginia Beach is down in the Tidewater area. And there actually is quite a bit of history in Virginia Beach. And so we got hired to do an interpretive plan for 3 historic houses in Virginia Beach from the 18th and 19th centuries. So the project began in March 2020. So our initial plans for the site visit did not go as planned. Initially, the goal was for me to make my way down, tour all the sites, and that did not happen. So the project was on pause for a bit. But eventually, it did get started up again. And we had these conversations with staff. We had the conversations with stakeholders. And the things that we kept hearing was, these houses are hidden gems. There's compelling stories here. But we don't want them to be hidden anymore. We want these gems to be out there for everybody to see and enjoy. So as part of the interpretive planning process, which stretched on for over a year, we did the site visit, we held stakeholder workshops, we met with local elected representatives, we held a public workshop where members of the public could come in and share their thoughts and ideas. We also did an online public survey. Again, many folks were understandably not quite comfortable with going to a public meeting when we were doing this work. And ultimately, the recommendations, it included things like new augmented reality experience, new tours, and for each one, the houses are now going to be better stitched together so that people will hopefully finish their voyage at one and then go on to the next one and then the next one, but they all retain their unique identity. So that hopefully gives you a good idea of all the different types of works that consulting historians do, and I've really just scratched the surface. There's so many stories to talk about. Consulting historians are doing just so many amazing work, including historic resources reports, surveys, all manner of things that if we had 12 hours, I could talk about and still not even fully cover. But if there's any takeaways from this, it's that history, it's ever evolving. The needs of the public relating to history are evolving too. 20 years ago, nobody's talking about augmented reality for a historic site. 20 years ago, social media is not exactly a thing, but now it's incredibly important. They've done studies that digital interpretation is a key way to get people invested in the site and retain people's interest after they leave. For many visitors now, the visit to a historic site, it doesn't begin when they pull up in the parking lot. It begins when they Google the name of the historic site. So sites need to be aware of that. The work of the consulting historian continues to evolve based on the sources and technologies. We do a huge amount of work now with digital databases that we didn't have 20, 30 years ago. 20, 30 years from now, we'll be using new sources that we didn't have access to in the past. And ultimately, history, it's a team sport. It's made possible by the work of archivists, transcriptionists, preservationists, copy editors, the folks who catch all my mistakes, and many more. I mean, so many of these projects. Interpretive planning, the recommendations for Virginia Beach, a lot of them came from the people we talked to. Arlington House, so much of the information came from Steve Hammond's research. The work we did for that litigation case where, we didn't have access to any scanners or anything, the work that the employees there did made that all possible. So history, it's never just one historian going somewhere and getting the research and the writing done. It's a team effort that involves so many people who oftentimes aren't acknowledged. So I just want to make sure that I acknowledge them as best as I can here. But again, it's a work, it's a collaborative work, it's an important work. End of the day, I really do believe that history is for everyone. We all have a past, we all have our stories, we're all connected to the histories of others. And that is why it is incredibly crucial to have historians who understand the historic method and can apply the skills of the discipline to unique situations so that the public can engage with the best possible public history out there, that they can make these connections, and that they can build that shared understanding and sense of stewardship. Well, I want to thank you all for coming out to the talk tonight. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. But again, thank you so much. Yes?
What were the three houses in Virginia Beach?
Absolutely. The Thorogood House, the Lynn Haven House, and the Francis Land House. So,
They are 17th century, are they not?
well, they thought that the Thorogood House was 17th century, but then new information came out stating that it was from the 18th century. Same thing with,
There must have been a house on that property before that.
well, there's a lot of debate about that, but they've more or less determined that the house you can tour today, no, that is from the 18th century.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead, David.
Does any of your work involve any kind of a distinction between the history of events, things people do, as opposed to the history of the private lives they lived?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it really kind of depends on the project. It does tend to lead more towards the events side. But certainly in terms of the things we talked about for the Emery Grove project, that was absolutely the way they lived. So, where they went to school, how they spent time with their families, the things they did at church. So absolutely, that's a key component, but it really varies depending on the project. Yes?
Is there any work being done in this field with public high school systems? There's been a lot of controversy here with changing the names of schools. I find that a lot of these school systems are ignorant of their history or cook things to fit a certain agenda. Where are we going with that?
Yeah, so I don't know of any instances of consulting historians working with high schools. I do know that, and History Associates has done work with institutions of higher education to, again, research the names of the folks that some of the buildings are named after, research their general histories. We did do an exhibit project for a private school in Tennessee at one point, and that wasn't really looking at the names on the buildings, but it did look into their involvement with segregation, their history of exclusion. So that was something that we worked with them on, but that was a little bit different than kind of, well, who's this person that it's named after and what's their legacy? So I haven't seen that too much with high schools, but it doesn't mean it's not happening. Yes.
There's a book, it's probably 25-plus years old now. Roy Rosenzweig, who was at George Mason University, before he passed away, was one of the co-authors, Power of the Past, I believe. And I don't know if you remember that or ever had it in class, but it was such a fascinating study of the American public and history. And one of the things they documented was that more people go to historic sites and places and museums than go to athletic events every year in America. And I just thought that was fascinating. Now, they have built larger arenas
Right.
for football, but I think it's really interesting that, you don't have the huge capitalization of history as you have football. So that you have all these people paying at one time to come in and watch this game or gamble or, fantasy football or all these things. And people may be doing that, and yet tons of people are going to all kinds of historic places for different reasons. Not
Yeah.
always just to learn something, but maybe to, with family, something to do. It's like we see people promenading on Old Town just to have something to do. But they're not promenading, not I-95,
Right.
Although of course you could actually walk across the cars on I-95.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't recommend that. But yeah, no, absolutely. And, it's interesting. The American Alliance of Museums did a survey recently, and museums, historic sites are some of the most trusted institutions in the country. So they're ranked even higher than college professors. So it really speaks to the value that these sites hold and, the importance of having good quality scholarship. And, that's something, and going to your other point about, people needing a place to walk around and just kind of take it all in. And that's absolutely something that comes up in interpretive planning is, you have some folks who it's like, well, it's a historic site, so you got to interact with the history. But ultimately, it's, it's that whole idea of you can't force somebody to read a wayside, and you can't force somebody to, take in information if they don't want to. But if you create an engaging experience, if you create a welcoming experience, you're going to make them more open to engaging with the past. So that's why a lot of the sites we work with, some of the battlefields, the recommendations are, keep letting joggers go through here, keep letting runners go through here. Because, I'm a runner, and occasionally, if I'm getting tired, I want an excuse to stop. A historic wayside is a perfect excuse to stop.
You can't stop at those signs, there's nowhere to stop most of the time.
Oh, no, I'm not talking about ones on the roadside. I'm talking about, like, if you're going through a park. Yeah. Yeah. Please be safe on roads, folks.
So, Scott, I have another thing. So at the last slide there, talking about the historic method. So I guess because you really revved me up, I wanted to do historic research again by the time you got done.
Hey.
Yay, I love it. It's like, no, that'll be another 10-year project, so no, I don't think I will. But when you, in your last slide, you talk about the historic method. And in a way, it's almost like a black box. What is that? So I want to throw out a challenge. How could we, Historical Society, whoever, actually have a discussion? What is the historical method? Or what methods do we use? And what is accurate? What is correct? What, ethical? And what isn't? I would love to be able to see that and have people engage in that and actually look at facts perhaps that are used in places and put them to the test of this historic method.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, I think in terms of like future events, I'd love to get some real prominent historians up on the stage and have them debate it. But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, the approach to the historic method, it evolves, it continues to evolve. I think about oral histories where for many years, they were kind of poo-pooed. And now we're really realizing that they can be an incredibly valuable source to fill in kind of the gaps in the record. But at the same time, oral histories, they're not perfect. I did a oral history project one time where I interviewed two people and they said very, very, very different things about when things happened, who's responsible for what. So absolutely, I think that conversation of how we engage with the past, how we engage with sources, what's more credible than the other, how do we determine credibleness, I think, it's an ongoing conversation, it's been an ongoing conversation. And yeah, I'd love to, again, get some prominent historians up there and just have them have them have a discussion about where we sit now and where we're going in the future. Yes?
Yeah, your company and my life are frighteningly intertwined. By the way, I'm Scott also.
Hey!
But my hometown is York, Pennsylvania.
Oh, no way.
And in March of 1979, when 3 Mile Island happened, I happened to be a junior at York College of Pennsylvania.
Oh, wow.
Which damn near killed me. Not because of radiation, but we all assumed we were going to die, and we figured, why die sober? Party, I've never partied before, because it was announced on the public unaware, like on a Friday night, and we kind of did lots of things we probably shouldn't have done through most of the entire weekend. And then, ironically, I joined the Army and I became a nuclear weapons custodian in spite of all that. And I have 2 T-shirts in the back of my closet that says, "I survived 3 Mile Island." So yeah, that was a memorable weekend.
Yeah.
Well, not that I really remembered all of it.
No, I can imagine. And I hope at some point somebody approaches you about doing an oral history, and I hope you say yes.
Yeah, that was a hell of a weekend.
Yeah. I think I saw one more hand. Yes?
What house were you picturing in Virginia Beach?
Oh, that was the Lynn Haven House.
The which?
The Lynn Haven House?
Oh, yes, yes. Are they all open now to be seen?
No, Thurgood is open.
Well, that's been open.
Yeah, Lynn Haven and Francis Land, they're doing a lot of structural work with each of them, so that's still ongoing last time I chatted with them.
Will they eventually be open?
Oh, absolutely.
Because when I was down there, I mean, there were 2 of them at least were lived in.
Mm-hmm.
They were good houses.
Yeah, no, the plan is for them to reopen because we talked about what they're going to do when they reopen, so I hope they reopen.
They saved the bad house, and the Admiral lives in it, the one next door.
Oh, okay.
James Bell Plantation House was a bad house. But it was brick, so they saved it.
Oh, okay.
And they tore the frame house down because, well, anyway, it was just like Ramsey House, that's how it was.
Yeah.
The
Mm-hmm.
church was moved, and they can't move all the
Yep.
way, so blah, 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 blah.
Yep.
But that,
Oh, I'm sorry. I want to. We're past 8 o'clock, so I want to make sure we answer everybody. But we can chat later. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering, in your litigation practice, what is the typical type of underlying case?
Yeah, I mean, it really varies. We do, I'd say the biggest chunk of our cases deals with environmental litigation. So it's oftentimes a question of, you have a site that was polluted, cleanup efforts are ongoing, who's liable for that cleanup? So who's responsible for polluting? And oftentimes, the question itself can be pretty complex. So if a site was active during World War II, we might find documentation that, Company A was using the material at the site. Well, that would indicate that they're liable. But during World War II, of course, the U.S. government is overseeing a lot of industry. So if there's documentation that the U.S. government was saying to Company A, use this particular chemical, then that means the government is also liable. So it's a lot of time it's doing research on that of, well, what was being done here? Were there any orders from somebody else about what should be done? What were the standards at the time? So like official government standards and specifications would say what you should be what you should be using. So it's a lot of kind of research about that. And then there's other cases relating to that. Again, the slavery disclosure research is under litigation. We do cases relating to Native American treaty rights in terms of specific actions that are allowed in certain areas of land. But yeah, I'd say the environmental stuff, that tends to be kind of the biggest chunk of the litigation work.
And then there's Camp Lejeune. Camp Lejeune.
You're going to have to fill me in, David. I've been talking to an hour.
Yes, you don't watch TV and see the thousands of commercials saying, contact a lawyer.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Which I don't think we've ever been contracted with that, but who knows? I think I saw one more question. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. It sounds to me like you have a history major's dream job. And I was wondering, what advice would you give to someone who maybe wants to follow in your footsteps?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So definitely build up your research skills, build up your communication skills, your problem-solving skills, and your teamwork skills. So those are really kind of the big things is, ultimately in the public history field, there's a lot of interest in it. A lot of people want to get engaged. involved with the work that we do. And this is true not just of consulting historians, but working at a museum or historic site. And in those instances, a passion for history isn't quite enough. Everybody applying has a passion for it. So building up those other skills, saying, yeah, I have experience with getting things done by a deadline. I have experience with taking the research and communicating it to others, beyond just my professor and my fellow students. Really being able to show that mastery and the ability to be flexible. I mean, I've been on projects where we get to a repository and it closes early, or like a freak accident happens. One of my coworkers was at an archive where they found a live round and they had to evacuate it and call the bomb squad. So you had to, you've got to be able to roll with the punches and be flexible. So if you show the commitment to research, you show those other skills, that's going to go a long way. And I'm guessing you're in college right now?
I am a 2020 Living Mary History graduate.
Hey!
Go try it.
Absolutely.
I got my master's at VCU in history, and I'm now a teacher.
Oh, wonderful. Well, no, it seems you've got a lot of those skills. So, yeah, well, feel free to take my business card, and happy to answer any other questions you might have. Yeah, absolutely. And likewise, same with everybody. Got my business card, so any questions you didn't have a chance to ask tonight, please feel free to do so. I'm always happy to chat.
Thank you, Scott. Very good.
Yeah.
Well, you crammed a lot of knowledge in only 7 years with this company. I can't wait to hear you in another 3. So that'll be a very long